Today's video was sponsored by Pop Culture Zone Pressing Services. If you need your comic books pressed, I personally vouch for Pop Culture Zone as being one of the best professional companies in the game, offering hands down the lowest prices out there. Services start at only $9.99, and every order placed will receive free fast track turnaround times. Even though I press comics for my personal collection, whenever I need a professional press for my key comics, I send them off to Pop Culture Zone, and every single book that I've received back, every single one, has had results that have exceeded my expectations, and I am sure that they will exceed your expectations as well. Make sure you go check the link in the description below to head over to their website, popculturezone.com, for complete details on services and how to begin your order. I want to speak to specifically the movie Spec hype, because we talked a little bit about, and Mickey, you said yourself, sometimes it's tough to tell when a new book comes out. Are they caring because it's a new character and they want to just collect him in the comics, or do they think he's gonna show up in a movie? But then you got DC that doesn't have that push that Marvel has had over the last decade plus. So you get characters like Punchline, who was very successful in terms of the hype. I don't think people were sitting there, oh, Punchline's gonna show up in a movie. It was more like, well, here's a character that's tied into one of the greatest villains of all time, and so forth. So I want to ask you guys though, and Ryan, I'll let you answer first here. When it comes to movie Spec, and looking back for me, and I don't think many of us were on YouTube as much back then, or like when in the early days of the MCU, 2008, 2012 with the Avengers, there wasn't as much there. The Key Collector app didn't exist, where you have this database that gave you instantaneous information. So we definitely were fed information differently, but I don't really recall it being as crazy back then. But I'm thinking that a big thing that really brought this movie hype Spec in was the first time that we saw Thanos in the end credit scene and in the Avengers, the first.
Yeah, and if you actually go back and look at prices from when that happened, you did see like a jump, right. And then it was level for a little bit. Then you saw another jump, and level for a bit, and you saw another jump. And that one, I actually looked at that one relatively recently because I was curious about where it stands now versus where it was. Now the whole Eros thing kind of threw a loop,
Yeah.
A wrench into that a bit, because it added another bit of spec to that, Iron Man 55. But even that book, that was one that I've talked about, where even that book, which is, it's one of my, like, Thanos is one of my favorite characters when I was a kid, because I grew up with the Infinity Gauntlet storyline and everything. And even that book was not immune to drops in prices once he was killed, in the movies.
Right.
It fell, almost in half. Maybe not quite that much, but pretty close. And that's a pretty big key issue, and
I just want to say real quick, sorry to cut you off, Marvel Goddess, thank you so much for the super chat. Truly appreciate it. All right.
Yeah. So, with respect to movie Spec, that kind of stuff, I don't think any book is really immune to it. Once that character is used up.
Well, let me ask you, I want to try to steer your thoughts specifically to, do you feel, outside of how it really, I don't know if you can put it outside of how it affects the books, because it's obviously correlated specifically to this, but do you feel, looking at the trajectory of how these books have done on the market as the MCU has grown and everything, are we at this crazy point right now where we put so much, and let me give you a little bit of context of where I'm coming from. I've always said, I think it's so great that, because there's a lot of people out there that say, well, you're going to let, somebody showing up in a movie and it's going to change what you want to pay for a book, or affect what you're going to pay for a book. That's crazy.
Absolutely, I will.
Yeah, it will. Yeah.
And I always say, it's we as collectors that grew up with these characters as kids, and we're seeing them in these movies, it adds on to the whole experience of how we experience these characters. And we're always gonna, just like we're always gonna have the comics, we're always gonna have the movies, and I think it drives our love for these characters, and that's why essentially it takes us back to the comics. And you can really understand it when you get into seeing really bigger characters, even bigger villains like Thanos, or when we saw Black Panther on screen for the first time. But do you feel that mentality of, oh well, they're showing up, it could be Pig's Pot Pete is going to be in the next Spider-Man.
I hope so.
Like, do you see what I'm saying? So what are your thoughts on that? Are we at this level? And again, this goes back to FOMO. Like, are we now blindly like, oh, they're in a movie, or they're in the MCU, and then I need.
Well, part of it though too is that it's not just that for me personally that it's that, oh, they're in that movie now, I'm willing to pay more for it. It's that when a character shows up in something that's more widely culturally available, you bring in new people that have an interest, and it does, and there's only so many of these books out there. I mean, that's the thing. Like with a lot of these, there's only so many of these books out there, and if you have an entity like Disney that has a huge reach, and you have like Black Panther making, I don't know if it crossed the $1 billion mark, but close to it, and having worldwide hundreds of millions, if not billions of people seeing that movie, it only takes a very, very, very small percentage of those people to go like, hey, maybe it would be cool to own that book, and now that starts moving up. It's another person that is now interested, that is contributing to the demand side of that equation. And so, yeah, being a more, culturally relevant character, it does have an impact, and it's hard to, I think it's difficult to say it doesn't.
For sure. And to that point, it's like I always say, a book is as valuable as it is relevant to pop culture, right? So like when you have AF-15, it's valuable because Spider-Man's always going to be in a movie. He's always going to have a cartoon. He's always going to be on pajama pants. Like he's always going to be relevant in that sense. So that's why that book is always going to be valuable. Whereas like Infinity Gauntlet 1, is going to be as relevant as it is, the movie that is there. But like, of course, these movies affect our perception and how we want to desire certain comic books. I mean, like we all only can have so much emotional investment into a character that we read in a comic book. And so sometimes it takes a movie for me to be like, oh, I never knew really like what that character was like, or I didn't know, like that's kind of what they stood for. And now I really like them. It's like, I didn't know who Vigilante was, but I watched Peacemaker. I'm like, this character's dope. I might go pick up I might go pick up an annual number 2. Like, that's how it, and it's like, it's not FOMO. It's just that it's like, I just didn't know anything about the character. And it took some pop culture show to introduce me to him because I wasn't going to put in the effort to read him myself. And also like, I like even movie spec aside, I mean, like how many collectors do you know that the reason they like X-Men is because of the animated cartoon? I was like, literally like 95% of everyone who is our age who's like, oh, X-Men's my favorite.
That's why I buy Avengers Annual 10.
Yeah, it's because you watch the cartoon. It's not necessarily because you just read the comic book.
Let me add to that because you touched. I was going to say this for when you wrapped up, and I was going to add this, but because you brought that up, I was just thinking like, we know Batman's, been around for 80 plus years, and every generation has grew up with them in some form or fashion. But the Batman the animated series, when I read Batman, I hear Kevin Conroy's voice, and sure, maybe I would have been a Batman fan if that show never happened, but it added so much to me, and it carried over into the comic book. So I wanted to say that because I'm just glad you brought up the X-Men animated too, because I think it's that very same thing.
And I think that's why people connected like Batman Adventures 12 so much. It's like that's the Harley Quinn that a lot of like us picture when we think of Harley Quinn. It's like that the animated version of Harley Quinn.
Yeah. And I think back to your point, Ryan, when you were mentioning the Thanos book and like how it had its dip and stuff, it's like, and for sure, all books I think are always going to have their dips and corrections. But like one thing that I think is interesting too, at least in terms of like the future outlook of the market, is it's like, remember the MCU was honestly a huge experiment, and they hit a grand slam.
Yeah.
And they hit it out of the park so far that this is a brand that is as important to Disney as Star Wars is. And like, like things are different now, I think. Now on the other end of Endgame and Infinity War, because it's like, even if this, whatever the next phase, let's say it's just not that good or it's not as cool or whatever, like Disney's not going to abandon this, or they're going to like, whatever, retool it and revamp it, and they're going to launch it again with like new, Cap and new Iron Man and stuff. Like this is a property that they're like, we can keep this going for like 50 years. Like there's no reason that they can't do exactly what they're doing in the comic books with it. And that's probably how they see it. And so I think that when you talk about like the phase of the first Infinity Saga and what comic books did at that time, I think like just still people were unsure, like, is this something that's really worth it? And I think that now it's kind of like, oh, okay, like this is going to go on for a long time. So my like emotional and financial investment into this thing, I mean, nobody really knows what's going to happen, but presumably has like a future with it. So
I mean, that's something that I do consider when I am thinking about the books I've bought. I mean, I buy books that aren't just related to what Disney and Marvel has. I've got my DC books up there. I've got pre-code horror books I like to buy, that kind of stuff. But like, I do like the fact that there is this behemoth of Disney, pushing comics. It does give you a little more faith in the longevity of that market, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Because Disney, they know how to make money.
Yeah.
So they know.
And
how
that's
to
the reason.
Stuff.
Sorry. And then that's the reason why the DC books just haven't quite caught on yet, because people don't yet believe that my investment into this thing is going to be, persistent. Like, but we're going to get Peacemaker season 2, and it seems like James Gunn's doing good stuff there. And it's like, oh, and now, spoilers, but like, I haven't seen. Sorry. Cut myself off. But like, I might buy a Peacemaker book because it feels like we're gonna get more Peacemaker. We're gonna get more.
I want to add though, and I always say this: DC books, especially when you look at keys, especially copper and older, they continue to increase in value, which goes to show. And I'm watching the chat, and there's a lot of people like, that maybe you guys are stuck in your ways. Maybe, you like how it was 30 years ago, and that's fine. Maybe you think Disney owning Marvel has watered it down, whatever the case may be. Maybe you don't like any of this overlapping when it comes to movies and comics, but guess what? At the end of the day, comic books are still a very feasible and collectible asset, because even if we didn't have movie hype, these books continue to increase in value as a long-term investment / collectible. So I just want to throw that in there to say that, we're not sitting here saying that, oh, comic books have to have movies or have to have Disney, or, that's not what we're saying, but we are where we're at right now. And if you are somebody that doesn't care about the movies or the TV shows, the comic books are going nowhere. The books that were printed at 12 cents are still there for you to go and collect and enjoy. The comic books that were printed at 30 cents are still there for you to collect and enjoy. And regardless of what other people say, some new comic books might be trash. There's a lot of good stuff out there too. So just enjoy comics how you want to enjoy it. If all this other stuff is just noise to you guys, but don't bash other people for understanding the positives and seeing what's going on right now. And I think this is a good way to sum up this piece of the show, because we got into this talking about FOMO and how, it could be worrisome and we can have concerns to a way that we're just, people can get burnt. Is it becoming an addiction? But then we covered such ground and came to all these different positive factors that are out there right now, to where we are really able to enjoy these characters and enjoy these properties on a level that I think we as kids probably would have never imagined. And it really is getting to so many more people, including this younger generation. And I could see that with my kids. And I'm sorry, at the end of the day, that is a beautiful thing. and that absolutely makes me happy.